Hello and welcome to Cloud Forest Vibes. My name's Bobby, and this is how I grow orchids and carnivorous plants. Hello and welcome to Cloud Forest Vibes. Today's video is going to be a video about resting orchids. We are here at the end of October, beginning of November transition. It's the day before Halloween, and it's time to start thinking about getting all of your plants, especially the resting types, ready for the winter and all of that. So today's video is going to be all about that. I'm going to go through my greenhouse a little bit and talk about some of the plants I have that require rests and different kind of rests and why. And hopefully I can help you guys and shed a little bit of insight in the topic. I know it's a hot topic in the orchid world, especially when you're just getting into growing and trying to learn what the difference is. And it can be kind of a scary thing, I guess. It was for me, I know it was, and it's not quite as bad as it sounds, at least not all the time. So having that said, I'm going to get right into my video here, and we are going to start talking about resting orchids and different types of rests for the winter. In general, just generally speaking, there is two ways to rest orchids. There is what I like to consider a harsh, dry winter rest, and then there's the drier in winter type, which is going to apply to a very broad range of plants, different types of orchids, and a lot of that is going to be based off of your conditions or your environment in general, at least in my opinion. So, having that said, dry winter rest. A dry winter rest, by definition, if you go by the classical textbook examples, is from around Halloween until sometime in February or March even. You will not give your orchids any water at all. They will survive off of the humidity in the air. They are supposed to be in areas that go through severe droughts in this time. South Pacific area is a great example, Australia, things like that, areas in Africa. There's lots and lots of places where for around 3 to 4 months a year, there is little to no rain at all. Now, having that said, there is still moisture. There's lots and lots of fog. They get morning dew, things like that. So it's not desert conditions, it's not completely void of moisture, and that is something that you're just going to have to keep in mind while I'm talking, and we'll circle back to later in just a few minutes, I promise. Having said what I just said, this is going to apply again to a broad range of different kinds of plants because it's from a very broad range of area around the world in the tropics. So you've got Cattleyas type orchids, you've got certain Dendrobiums, resting type Dendrobiums that go through a pretty harsh winter rest. You've also got some bulbophyllum orchids that are in that category. Believe it or not, some Phalaenopsis orchids that are in a pretty harsh winter resting environment, or climate at least in the wild. You've got angraecoids. A lot of angraecums and angraecoid type orchids go through a pretty dry time in their life. And of course any orchid that comes from a xerophytic environment. So certain Talumnias and desert type orchids or savanna scrubland type in the subtropics, those also get a very dry time of the year, a lot of them. So like I said, you can't really apply it to any one genus or any one type of orchid. A lot of them are affected by it. And again, the best way to learn about this and to know about your orchid is to learn about where it comes from. For instance, Australian orchids are going to be different than other types of orchids. The orchids that come from South Pacific and southeastern Asia, they're going to be different. They're also going to need a type of rest, but the climate is radically different in both locations. The humidity levels might be consistent or something like that, but if you don't know that those orchids come from different areas, we'll use Dendrobiums as the example, because there's a lot of Dendrobiums that come from Australia that get a pretty dry, harsh rest. There's a lot of Asian type Dendrobiums, long cane Dendrobiums, and things like that that are supposed to get a pretty harsh, dry winter rest by definition. If you don't know what locale and what area these plants come from, you may give them the wrong type of rest. Like I said, these areas are from different types of the world, and though they're drought-stricken for the 3 or 4 months a year, they do have high humidity. There are areas that are drier than others, and areas that don't have the same type of moisture. So one area where it may get a lot of dew, The other area may not. It may never see dew. However, it may get fog or mist that rolls in off the ocean. Those two types of things, I know it sounds foolish, but they saturate things differently. They water the plant differently in the natural environment than it would, say, a rainfall or anything else. So that is something that when I'm watering my resting orchids and things like that, or taking care of them throughout the winter, I do keep in mind. Like I said before, even though they're dry resting type orchids, they are not completely void of water and moisture in those times. Now, this brings me to the second type of orchid, the drier in winter types. Now, this is going to apply based off of, in my opinion, again, environmental conditions more than anything else. If your environment is a drier environment, you've already got drier in winter. You're going to have to worry about not overwatering your plants and things evaporating from your pots or your mounts fast enough and things like that. However, you're already covered in one part of it because your growing environment is drier in the winter. So another way to produce a drier environment is scaling back your humidifiers, things like that. My humidity level is set pretty high from spring through fall. In the wintertime, I actually adjust my thermostat lower, and I also adjust my humidity levels a bit lower. Instead of 80% being where my humidifier kicks on, I might take it down to 75 in here, maybe 73%. That's going to invoke drier growing. It's going to allow me to monitor the moisture in the sphagnum moss and medias on the mounts a lot better. And for those orchids that want to be drier in winter, it's going to allow me to keep them a little bit drier. So a lot of times you'll hear us growers say, when it is in growth, water and feed well. And that is exactly what that means. When the plants are showing leaves or root growth, spike growth, you want to water them pretty regularly if they're that type of plant. They don't have a dry cycle or anything like that. And even the ones that do, I prefer to adjust my media conditions. So a lot of the ones that need to have a regular dry cycle, I don't grow with any media. They grow bare-rooted on bark. That's also a great way to grow resting type orchids, especially ones that don't need to be perpetually moist. In my opinion, it's an easy way to see just how moist the roots are. If they're white, they're dry. If they're green, they're moist. So that is a nice indicator. And for drier in winter types, I either let the orchid or media dry completely between waterings for a day, maybe 2 days, before I water it again. And when I'm watering it, a lot of times I'm not saturating it. I'm not watering it dripping wet. I'm just keeping the media a little bit moist to the touch in between the next time it dries out or gently dries. Now, there are going to be orchids that do not want to dry out, so this again comes back into doing your own research. And again, a lot of that's going to be based off of your conditions. This tent holds moisture like you wouldn't believe. In the wintertime, when my tent is cooling down, it actually forms condensation on this. So I've added a dehumidifier in here over the years, and that really helps with that. But factors like that, air humidity and air movement, those are all going to factor into me, at least, for being able to keep your orchids happy during the resting time. If they do not want to stay wet, do not keep them wet. Now, drier in winter type orchids. For me, this is an even broader application. I would say all orchids, but that's my environment and that's my opinion. Now, certain pleurothalids, Draculas, things like that, you can pretty much grow them consistently moist all year long, no issues. Certain Oncidium types, same story. That is how they want to grow. Certain Bulbophyllums even, that is just how they want to grow. However, in my experience, a lot of times, a lot of my root loss, a lot of my media going sour, and things like that happen in the cooler months. It's just a better time for the bacteria and the fungus and things to set in because things do tend to stay damp longer. They do tend to break down faster, and it is just one of those things. So a big part of drier in winter for me, it's applicable to just about all of my orchids, whether they're traditional dry winter resting type orchids or not, because it's about preserving your media, it's about preserving your roots, and this is something that each and every one of you in your environment is going to have to experiment with and see just how to do that for yourselves. I don't mean that you're on your own, of course, but what I do mean by that is that you have to learn how to control the moisture levels in your media during the winter time. And that is, for me, the most important factor of any type of dry resting plant. That goes back to what I said again, of they are not completely devoid of moisture. So I'm going to get in here now and skip all the babble, and we'll talk about some specific types of orchids and how I care for them, and why. So it'd be hard to start off the resting talk without talking about Dendrobiums first. That is what I grow. I do not have any Cattleyas types, so I'm going to leave that out of this discussion for the most part. This is a great example right now of a resting type Dendrobium because it is doing what they do. You see it's dropping its leaves here. That is completely normal. I let them fall off naturally typically, but just wanted to show you that. So this orchid is Dendrobium unicum. This was my first true cane type resting Dendrobium. This year it's put on this awesome growth and it's starting to drop its leaves. It's got its terminal leaf here and there is some swellings along the sides. Now, as far as Dendrobiums go, this terminal leaf is what really dictates this being done growing. It sets different. Roger talks about it, a lot of growers talk about it, but this leaf, the last leaf, is how you will always be able to tell when this orchid is done growing. As I pointed out, it's quickly dropping its foliage. It drops it usually from the back all the way to the front, and the cane will go bare, just like this one from last year. This will rest through the winter, and in the springtime, at some point in time, it will bloom from this cane, from those swellings opposite to each of these leaves. Now what the rest is important for with Dendrobiums is getting them to bloom in the spring. In order to assure that, what I do is I increase their light level and I lower their feed level and their total water intake, and most importantly, the temperature must drop several degrees from their normal summertime growing temperatures, or their growing season growing temperatures. From spring to fall in my tent, I usually have it between 65 and 67 degrees as a low in my tent. At night, our highs between 78 and 80 degrees. In the wintertime, my high temperatures during the daytime are going to shift down to about 75 or 76 degrees max, and at night they're going to get a drop in temperatures down to around 59 or 60 degrees. I let this happen from around now. I'm going to start this coming week dropping my temps down to about 60 degrees at night, and from there they're going to stay there until sometime in February or March. As far as the increase of light, I do not ever move this orchid. This orchid lives here full-time during the year, but outside of the window right behind us, I have trees. Those trees filter out and block out a lot of the sunlight, and during the growing season, this thing grows in a lot of shade. Almost all of the light that it gets, in fact, comes from the LED grow lights above. During this time of year, the sun drops down in the sky, and for the next 3 or 4 months, this is actually going to get direct sun through the window in the morning hours of the day for a couple hours. That's enough for me to invoke blooms in the spring. It's an increase of light. Since this grows pretty much void of the sun most of the time, an increase in actual sunlight for this plant is huge. That is a lot of additional light for this orchid. I was able to bloom this last year, so I know my method works. I'll throw bloom pictures up on the screen here. They are gorgeous. Absolutely must have resting type Dendrobium, and it's pretty easy to grow. It doesn't have to get too cool in the wintertime in order to bloom, which is very much important to me. I cannot take this much lower than 60 degrees. I have too many plants in here that would suffer if I did. Now, other plants that actually get a relatively harsh rest in my environment include Bulbophyllums. This is a Bulbophyllum maximum. This is going to get identical treatment to the Dendrobium that I just mentioned. The Bulbophyllum barbagirum as well. That's another African Bulbophyllum. These are both African Bulbophyllums, and the area in the world that they come from gets a very, very dry season. So both of these plants get a dry rest. This is a great example of a strong Bulbophyllum, and now that I started resting this plant, last year was the first year I did that. The purpose of that is to get strong growth the following season. So again, I don't know if you can see this plant or not. It is one of my larger orchids, and a lot of times it's hidden, but it is absolutely massive. And I do think it grew stronger this year than it ever has before, and I do believe the reason for that is the rest. It really did do well. In addition, the Bulbophyllum barbagirum, it bloomed for me for the first time this year, and this season has put out 4 new growths, and 2 of those directions of growth are brand new, so I can also attest to this growing much stronger and much better after I rested it for the first time last year. There's plenty of other types of plants that need a rest. Here's a great example of a Cattleyas type that is supposed to get a very dry rest. Let me get this in better light. Now, I know you're saying, Bobby, this plant kind of looks like crap. I would totally agree, but I did have some issues with this plant this year. I grew it a little bit too moist for a little while, and this does not like to be moist. This is Laelia lilliputana. It's a rapiculus laelia, and as you guys know, a lot of them grow very, very dry. So I had some root loss. It was stored, it was being kept in the position next to a different plant that grows bare rooted on cork, and it got watered every day. So this kind of got a little bit of overspray every single day, and it did not like it. Having that said, it does have some pretty happy new growths. Those growths that you see are all new from this season, and it does tend to shed leaves off of them over time. So not all of these are, sickly bulbs or anything like that. The one that was sickly right here got rotten, and I cut it off, and you see the cinnamon mark there from that. However, that is neither here nor there. This orchid is a resting type orchid. If you look it up on iSoap, the information there says that this orchid for 3 to 4 months a year needs a distinct dry rest. It gets mists and dews, I guess, occasionally. I think it grows in sub-zero fit conditions, so it's kind of almost a desert grower. Again, it grows on rocks, and it's a very, very strange plant. So it really, really needs to dry out quite a bit and stay cooler in the winter for a little while. This is the first year I'm going to do that. I have a few other Cattleyas types. Cattleya pumila is one of them. Diana, Laelia Diana, Cattleyas Diana is another one of them. There's several types of Cattleyas that really need, or are supposed to get at least, some sort of rest in the wintertime. I know that's debatable. I know Michael McCarthy would disagree. Anything that blooms in the summer, he says, does not need a winter rest. But I am going to at least give them a partial rest or grow them much drier this winter and see if that does help them grow stronger at least, or provoke maybe blooms next year. But this one for sure is going to get a rest. We're going to see what it does. Now, this plant here is one that you may never ever associate with having any type of rest, but this is a Phalaenopsis. This is Phalaenopsis mannii. This is a Himalayan species, and where this comes from, there is an extremely pronounced dry season. So very, very little to no rain falls. It's in a rain shadow, and this relies solely off the moisture from clouds and fog and dews that it gets in the wild. So it grows in stream areas around water typically, so very high humidity all winter long will help this thing keep ticking over, and the occasional misting or fogging. But this does not stay moist. This usually gets watered every day, gets fed very, very often, being a phal, in the spring, summer, and fall. But now is the time of season where I'm going to start letting this thing really dry out, and it is only going to get just a little bit of misting every now and then with the other resting type orchids. I did that last year for the first time, and the growths that came out this year are bigger and badder than ever. I know this was still a seedling when I got it, but they are progressing quite nicely and healthier than it was before, I can honestly say. So another type of resting orchid again, and all these different orchids, some of them you might not necessarily think were capable of doing that or anything else. Phalaenopsis I know are not typically thought of as a dry winter rest type orchid, but because of their environment, because of where they come from, they absolutely do need a rest. Another plant that needs it, a lot of them, like I said, angraecoids. This is my Arangus punctata from Daryl Adams, and Arangus punctata definitely require a rest. Not a harsh rest. Again, this is going to get treated just like the Phalaenopsis we looked at, just like all the other ones. Again, I don't believe in growing them too dry like some people say, but they will, all the plants that we've just listed and just looked at are probably going to stay dry for at least a week in between any kind of real watering. I carry high humidity, even though I'm going to take it down to about 75% for my humidifier and stuff to kick on. It's hardly ever going to kick on. I know this place. The tent seals moisture in, and it's probably going to still hover around 80% minimum, maybe 85 at times. in this tent all winter long. So, now that we have looked at a few dry winter resting, or the true resting types, in my opinion, the ones that I grow at least, not all of them, but a good chunk, a good section, it's time to have a look at the other orchids, the Drier in Winter types. And I am scanning around right now so you guys can soak all this in, because you are looking at them. Every single orchid in this entire grow tent gets drier in winter conditions. Most of them I let gently dry between waterings. Some of them get drier than others. Starting up here with the Brassias, you've got all these Cattleyas types, Tolumnia types, things that don't have a true rest. Sulphur-90s, you've got plenty plants that will keep growing through the winter. They might just slow down a bit, but a lot of them keep growing. A lot of these bulbophyllums keep growing. A lot of the Dendrobiums, things like that keep growing. Pleurothalids, Masdevallias, things like that keep growing. All of them keep growing throughout the winter for me. They do not get a dry winter rest, but each and every one of them, if I water them like I do in the summertime, and I don't let them get gently dry in between waterings, even my Masdevallias, even my Pleurothallis types, Pleurothalids proper, a lot of these plants would just keel right over and die. The Dendrobium, Rhodostictum, this is a Latoria type Dendrobium. This plant does not ever want to go dry and stay dry for a really, really long time. The roots on this plant, most of them, you can see, they have grown to the outside of the moss. They're all over the bark. They're everywhere on this orchid. Well, you can't really see. Sorry, terribly out of focus, guys. As you see, I grow it mounted, just like everything else. The roots are exposed. They grow on the bark, they grow in the moss, they grow on top of the moss, they grow where they want to grow. But I keep this thing pretty well saturated all the time in growth. Right now it's just got the starts of some new growths pushing. It tends to do that in the winter, I don't know why. But what I do is I just ease everything back. Now, I just watered these plants yesterday, so you'll see it is pretty moist. But from here on out, this whole mount is going to get very gently dry in between waterings. When I do water it, I'm not going to soak it down like this. What I'm going to do is I'm going to just moisten this moss. I'm going to get it to where it's spongy feeling, moist to the touch, and even though it may get watered, every day still, or every other day, it's not going to be excessively watered. So these roots are going to have a lot of air. They're not going to get smothered. They're not going to get too cold at night, and they're going to live. It did last year. It worked beautifully last year, and I'm going to do the exact same thing this year, because look at our results. I've got 5 blooms on this thing, 2 spikes. I did grow it through the winter, but I grew it drier in winter instead of dry in winter. That is what Latoria types want in my environment. An orchid that not a lot of you might think about needing a drier period in the winter are these. These are my Dendrophylax orchids, or my leafless ghost orchids. And though they do not stay dry all winter long by any means, if you let these stay dry for too long, they will keel over and die. They get much, much less water. I water these once a day, no matter what. Sometimes they get watered twice a day if it's warm and I get worried about them. They do like to be moist, but they do okay drying out in between waterings. Now, in the wintertime, if I were to water these every day, they would undoubtedly stay too moist, and at nighttime they would get too cold and the roots would be unhappy, so they would start to die back. So what I do is I scale back the watering. Just like in winter it's drier, I let these do the exact same thing. I let them dry between waterings, and I keep them dry for a day in between watering them again. So where I water them every day now, sometimes twice a day in the summer, these are only going to get watered once every other, or sometimes even once every 3rd day in the wintertime, and they're going to do just fine. If I think that they need water, I will water them. I will not let them suffer by any means. If I notice that 3 days is too long, then it will be every other day. But even my Dendrophylax, even my ghost orchids, I grow drier in the winter. Again, it is applicable to just about everything in here. Very few plants do I have in this grow environment, except for Draculas and Pleurothalids, want to stay moist all year long. And even then, all my Draculas, like this, this plant specifically, I can tell you, you see here, I have roots growing on bark, aerial roots, whatever you want to call them. I keep a high humidity level in here anyway. This plant gets pretty dry in between waterings. A lot of my Draculas do. I do not let them sit wet or too moist for any period of time. When you do that, you start to affect the base of the plant and the rhizome, and when you do that, you start losing leaves, losing roots, and your plant will die or go downhill and become a rescue. And that is not what we want. So the moral of the story is everything drier in the winter. Watch your humidity levels, watch the moisture content and the moisture holding abilities of all the medias that you use, whether it be sphagnum moss, whether you're using, tree fern. I've got, synthetic sphagnum moss that I'm using now on certain plants. We're trying that out. We've got cocoa husk, traditional bark mixes, and everything else. But that is part of the Drier in Winter thing. You've got to learn what your medias are doing. If you want to grow anything successfully through the winter that doesn't need to be kept moist, make sure you know how long it takes your media to dry out and water appropriately. As for the dry winter resting types or the harsh winter resting types, those again are mostly going to need an increase in light and a decrease in the nightly temperatures. You're going to slow down the feed, or you may not feed at all, depending on how you feel about that. I still feed a little teeny weeny bit, but I do not feed like I do in growth. That's for sure. I'm more likely to give supplements like CalMag or kelp. I do not give calcium nitrate in the wintertime. I don't think it's necessary because most of the plants that are resting do not grow, but their roots do need to maintain, in my opinion, and they do need to have strength in the canes. So the calcium really helps them do that, and the kelp really helps them know when to do that. So I hope that explains a lot of this. Again, I've had lots of people ask me about this, and this is my take on it. At least that's how I do it in my environment. The books will tell you other things, I'm sure. Other growers will tell you other things, I'm sure. And to each their own. Everybody grows differently. Again, I grow in a grow tent in my house, so I don't have to deal with the external conditions. I don't have to fight the cold per se. I don't have a lot of those other issues to worry about. And I'm very blessed, but again, it's harder for me to get this thing cooler. I have to make sacrifices, and I have to live a little bit colder in the wintertime sometimes because the window here has to be cracked at night in order for me to get my nighttime drop downs and all that. So everyone's going to grow differently. They're going to have their own methods of doing this, but so that is my video on resting type orchids and my take on Drier in Winter. I hope you guys enjoyed. I hope you learned something from it, but the keynotes, I guess, to take away from this are definitely do your research. Look up your orchid. Look up orchidspecies.com or any number of different valuable resources. AOS, all kinds of places will have information on this. Learn the genus, learn your specific species, see where they come from in the world. I even take mine as far as I look up weather patterns and stuff in other places. I'm kind of a nut about it. So anyhow, that is number one. Definitely do your research. You're going to want to grow your dry resting types brighter. You're going to want to drop the temperatures down at night and really monitor your media. Monitor how much moisture is getting into your system, how much moisture is being retained by your mounts and different medias and things like that, and adjust accordingly for your environment, for your conditions. Those are the most important factors. Those are the most important takeaways from all of this. I know I can get a little bit long-winded and stuff sometimes, and hopefully that's not too confusing for you all, but I do like to try to give you guys as much information as I possibly can about these topics. So please reach out. I'm available in the comments. I'm available on my social media pages. If you have any questions or concerns or want any clarifications for any of this stuff ever, I'm almost always available. It may take me a couple days to get back to you, but I always respond, and I always do try to lend a hand or advice when I can. And I know that we've danced around and looked at a couple blooms in here, but before we go, we are going to look at a couple because they are definitely worthy of seeing before they're gone. Something that's been hiding from us around the corner here is this lovely Cattleya. That's Laelia harpophylla. We've got some twinkles. We've got this awesome Sologeny still open here, guys. You'll see that in an upcoming video if you haven't already. You know, my Dendrobium, we saw this Dendrocolum is starting to go crazy. And my favorite right now, very, very, very favorite right now, is the Encyclia tampensis. This plant is just really showing off, and I love it. The other spike is starting to open too. You guys will see this soon. I wish you guys could smell it. But anyhow, thank you guys as always for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you guys again soon.